We will now interrupt your regularly scheduled programming for this Good Old Blades micro podcast.
Dovetailed bolsters can be a really cool feature to bolster work on knives that it doesn't really get done as much in the modern knife making era as it did back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s. It is, traditional in that sense, but not a lot of makers do it anymore. So I thought I'd go through some of the steps that I've done for dovetail bolstering and what I found to be the easiest. Now, if you go to YouTube and look for dovetail bolsters, there's a few really good videos out there to actually demonstrate the process. But essentially, the idea, at least, being that if you think about a knife and bolsters as having the front chamfer towards the ricasso of the blade, the dovetail is the opposite on the tang side of the blade, and it looks like a little dovetail when you have both of them positioned correctly. I think the largest thing that you have to remember about dovetailing is that there are several vectors of geometry that draw your eye to the dovetail, and if you don't get it lined up correctly, it can look pretty bad. So the steps that I'm going to tell you to follow are basically to help you align that. Now, when you're choosing your material to do dovetail bolsters, you're going to want to be able to pin those bolsters. When you pin those bolsters, you're going to want to be able to hide them. So you got to get good at hiding pins. The easiest way, obviously, is to choose like material. If you choose copper, brass, or nickel silver, the largest problem that you're going to have is that pin stock and bar stock tend to be of a different alloy, even like ever so slightly. And so you might luck out and you might get a nickel silver or something that it matches your flat bar stock material, and you might get copper the same way and whatnot. You might do pretty well. But just know that your pins might show up or have some silhouette or ghost of the pin. And if that happens, it's typically because the alloys are different, just ever so slightly. Where I've found that this is not much of a problem is when using stainless steel, but specifically 416. So you can get 416 bar stock, and if you go to a welding supply place, you can get 416 3/32 rod, TIG rod, and that's the cleanest kind to use. It has a mirror finish on the outside and everything. It's super clean, and that's what I prefer to use because sometimes matching up nickel, silver, or copper, or brass can sometimes be a problem. So moving on. Once you get your pin stock and your bar stock, and it's the right alloy, then you're going to want to take a single piece of your bar stock to do your dovetailing. Reason being is that to cut bar stock down and then to do dovetailing, you're going to have geometry differences because they're going to be ground differently, and it's just a lot easier unless you're doing a milling operations or whatever. Like if you're doing this all by hand with disc sanders or your belt grinder or whatever, that you do all at one piece, all in one piece, and then you'll just cut it later. So measure the total width of your blade, and then double that, and then add a few thousandths more because you have to account for the kerf of your saw. Specifically if you're using a bandsaw to cut it in half. There's no real problem with having more material, but if you have less, you're going to be doing all this stuff, and when you cut it in half, you're not going to have enough for both sides of the knife. So everything on the show side of the bolster has to be done entirely up to your final grit in order to make it look right. Because once you attach them to the blade, there's not a lot that you're going to be able to do with finishing unless you're very, very careful, because you might actually sand the blade, even if you have it taped off. It's just kind of like a real pain in the butt. Trust me, I know. I've tried it, and it's just easier if you finish everything up to your final finish, whether it's a satin or a buffed finish, before you put the bolsters on the blade. When you're doing the reverse side, that's supposed to be dovetailed. You don't have to have a very high grit. I usually do about an 80 to 100 grit, and it's mostly because when you're putting your handle scales on and everything, you're going to be doing the opposite in order to fit into that dovetail pocket. And you want to have that a lower grit too, because you'll epoxy that in. So it'll have several points of contact, not only to the tang, but then also to the entire surface of the bolster. And you want to make sure that it adheres really well so it doesn't flex or anything. So a disc sander is probably the most straightforward and true way to grind down your bevels. But you can also do it on a tilt table or a work rest that tilts. If you can do like a 45 to a 60 degree angle, I think looks the best. Obviously, the more aggressive you are in the angle, the more swallowtail versus dovetail they'll kind of look. But you can kind of play around with it. As long as you can match that same angle on the reverse side of your scales, and it's repeatable, you should be fine. So, grind both sides, finish out the front side, and then cut the bolster in half. And then what I do is, on the knife itself, you have to usually drill 2 holes is the preferred method at the very least. And what I do is I super glue the bolster to the tang, and I use a square to make sure that everything is squared up right on one side. And then what I'll do is I will drill through the opposite side of the tang to drill into the bolster. Then you go through and just deburr it, and you can choose to pop that off, or you can affix a file guide to where the ricasso is at, and everything will hold that line in place. And then you pop your other bolster on, you super glue it, and then you drill through the other bolster that you already put holes in, and drill through the bolster that you just popped on. If everything's all fair and equal and the super glue holds and whatnot, you'll have 2 bolsters that are there and have holes in them, and they line up correctly. The next thing that you're going to have to do is clean those things really well, because one of the problems with bolsters in general, but also dovetail bolsters, is that because of the geometry and everything, if you don't clean it well, you're going to have gaps. So you're going to have gaps between your bolsters and your tang. And if you don't line things up correctly, you're going to also have this geometric difference where the tips of the bevels on the inside where the tang is at are not going to line up, and the ends of the dovetails are not going to work either. So just make sure that everything is cleaned up really well, so you can at least start off the process of mating those 2 bolsters together on the tang, and there's no gaps. When you're doing all of your final positioning, a file guide helps an awful lot. It'll keep everything lined up really well. Just make sure it's tightened on there well enough, and then you cut your pin stock, the entire thickness of the bolster end to end, plus half the diameter of your rod times 2. So you want to make sure that there's enough sticking out that you can mushroom it into the hole. I might add a very, very slight chamfer to the hole itself, but I really try not to, because there's dirt and other debris and things like that can get in there, and you want to try to hide your pins as best as possible. So you just want to mash the crap out of the pin. And if you have a chamfer in there, it really doesn't do a lot for the mechanical holding component of it. And it just adds some ability that when you're grinding those pins down and you're contouring your bolster stock, that you might have gaps or things. So if you can keep the shaft of the hole pretty well straight and not chamfer it too much, then that's the way to go. It's the cleanest look that I've seen. It's the easiest to maintain. A few ways that you can mash your pins or press your pins. One obviously is you can use a punch and a hammer. You can also use a mill vise, and if you have a pin press, it is a bottle jack and a hydraulic process to pin them, where you can use anvils. You can also use that, but some guys make them. I inherited mine, but it was made by somebody who had a lathe and a milling machine to make everything true and equal. But I like that a lot of the time because I get the additional force that I need to push those pins in very solidly. But a really good mill vise, like a Kurt vise or something with a strong enough jaws, will also do the same thing, and you won't mess up your vise. So press the pins together and make sure it's all very, very firmly in place, that the pins are hidden and everything. You do that by once everything's pressed together, you'll grind the face off of them and make sure that there is nothing silhouette-wise that you see. If you see any gaps at all at the point where you flush those pins up, you got to start over again. Otherwise, you're just going to have to accept the fact that it's an inferior operation of applying the dovetails. What you do is, if you have any material left on the sides, you cut those off with a bandsaw, and then you can do all of your profiling with those on, and then contour them. I'm pretty big on contouring bolster material before I contour handle material, just because it helps to avoid the mismatch in material hardness and then gouging right behind the bolster. So that's what I do. So everything gets profiled on the dovetails, and then I fit up my handle material. Something to remember with dovetails is that because of the way that it contacts the bolster itself, your handle material has a higher propensity towards slipping and sliding, and you have to watch out and make sure that handle material is square and making contact on all points of that dovetail. Otherwise, you'll only find out after you've ground down all of this material, and then it is very, very difficult to get that thing out. You almost have to take the entire bolster and handle material off in order to get it done. You might be able to clean it up a little bit, but your mileage may vary. When you're doing your handle material, you're just going to take the outside facing, or the show side of your handle material, and flip that over so it's facing down on the platen or your work rest or whatever. And you're going to grind that off in an opposite 60 or 45 degree angle. Then when you flip it back over, you can shove it up into the dovetail, and it should look right. Do dry fits a few times, and then when you get ready to glue, I'll glue the scale material on first, or epoxy it on first, and let it sit. And then I will drill my holes, and then I will do the same thing on the opposite side with the handle material, and I'll attach both, so that way I'm only dealing with one possible screw up at a time. And you might be able to get that handle material off, heat it up or something, and still be okay. But the dovetail will have to be cleaned really well in order for you to fix the mistake. Either way, once you get the scales on and the holes drilled and everything set, then you can flush up or reprofile the handle material, and then contour as need be. Just make sure when I use cant twist clamps. Sometimes I will just use regular spring clamps to hold the material in place. The idea at least being that it doesn't shift when it's drying. And if you can do that and follow some of those basic steps, you can have really great looking bolsters that are dovetailed. I think it looks real classy when it's profiled up and contoured. It looks real good. And especially if you're doing taper tangs, dovetail bolsters and taper tangs create this arrow effect that is really interesting. and adds a depth of embellishment to blades. So it's something to think about. They're fun. They're not as easy as square bolsters, but if you want a little bit of extra challenge, try doing some dovetail bolsters and see how you like them. Hope this helps.